start off saying it is the biggest privilege and honor for me to be here today and also host this particular panel discussion. We wanted to start the Venture Local Conference off with some history. I think as we move forward in our town, it's important to acknowledge where we've been, not just individually, but economically as a downtown, and who all has contributed to where we are today. And so with our panelists, they're all experts in the history of Western North Carolina, specific to African American history and economic history, especially with economic development. So we're going to keep a general discussion going because they are rich, I mean chock full of knowledge, and I don't want to limit them with my questions. And then of course we'll save time for questions at the end from the audience. I'm a little nervous because I'm so excited. So let's start with what is the history of this particular region as we know as downtown, including the South Slope? Who would like to start? We'll be sure to project so that everyone can hear you in the back.
Okay, hi, I'm Sasha Minto. I have to say that when I was asked to join this panel, I quickly pulled up a map and I went to identify what exactly is South Slope and how does it fit in with what have traditionally been historic Black business districts and neighborhoods. And the reason that I would even classify it that way is because of the boundaries set up by segregation. So where maybe in the future we won't talk about neighborhoods and communities in that way, because that is the history of our area, there are still these boundaries and markings of what was where, and those are the reasons why. So this particular area was a little more industrial mix, and housing, south side area was actually a very large area. But if you talk about the city as a whole, obviously there's a main business district downtown, and then on the east side was a black-owned business district that grew out of what was once, long ago, a slave community that served the business owners that owned those slaves. I don't like to say that, but that operated businesses, many hotels, service businesses, very much like we have now, heavily tourist-based industries. And then these people worked for them and had a small settlement area where they lived. And then as slavery ended, Isaac Dixon, whose name you may know, purchased a land parcel, and it became what they call Dixontown, one of the small communities. And that's just one, and actually these maps are showing that. This is an older map. I think it might be late 1800s, or the road that's curved in the bottom actually still says Negro Road, and there were houses there that were once slave homes. And then as we move forward, these are the Sanborn fire maps, then you can see that there's a very dense number of businesses. Those are all Black-owned businesses in a segregated area. And so when you look at Black business and business as a whole, they're concentrated in certain areas, and strictly local because that was very, very easy.
Great, Doctor.
Okay, thank you. It's good to be here. I guess Sasha has given you a really good rundown of this. As many of you know, I'm an educator. So my focus is always on what we do within the academy itself and how we treat these subjects. As many people know, I was born and raised here in Asheville and left in 1985 to begin my college career. I was away for 25 years and then came back. And what brought me back was my own research. And as I was working through my PhD at Chapel Hill, when it was time for me to decide what I wanted to write about, I decided I wanted to write about Asheville and to look at the history of the development of the African American community here, because no one really had focused on that. So this is one of the challenges, I think, for the Academy, is to not only begin to acknowledge this history, but find a way to incorporate it into the larger narrative about the history of the state, about the history of the region. And that remains a challenge. I think we're doing a good job at the academic level, at the university level, but there's still challenges, I think, at the secondary level. So for a while, my research began with a question, when did African Americans come to this region and why? When you look at the research that historians had done, up until the time I began my research, well, there was one historian before me, John Inscoe. Many of you may know that name. And John really, I would argue, is an expert on slavery in Western North Carolina. He published a book, I think in 1988, entitled Mountain Masters. And I would strongly advise you, those of you who are interested in this particular topic, to read John's book. But one of John's challenges in that book was that the story is told through the eyes of the slave owner, not through the eyes of African Americans themselves. And that remains a challenge because sources are so few, but we're making every effort that we can to try to bring those voices. But what was most important was acknowledging that African Americans had been here and that they had been here as slaves. I mean, there was this understanding that this region, because of the terrain, that it wasn't a place where slavery would be able to thrive as far as plantation agriculture was concerned. But when we looked at it, what we saw was that the slave owners who were here, people like Zebulon Vance and his family, the Swains, that they found other ways to use that slave labor. And if you look at some of the sources that I examined for my dissertation in that first chapter, looking at the question of slavery in this region, showed a number of people who came through the region. One British abolitionist who was here at one point talked about how it was the slave labor that actually worked in what would be known as an early tourism industry. And so they're working in hotels, they're working in restaurants and things of that nature. So I think the biggest thing that I was able to establish, and people like John Inscoe have been able to establish in their work, was that the African American presence was here, and now we need to acknowledge that and understand it.
That's great. Thank you. Stephanie, I want you to actually piggyback on that. As a CEO, and you've been the CEO of Eagle Market Streets Development Corporation for quite some time, and prior to that, you had worked on the block doing other things for many years as well. So from an economic development standpoint, I mean, I've lived here 12 years. I know you've been on the block for at least 12 years. Talk to us about, I mean, we're just talking about the 1800s, right? Let's just jump forward a little bit. And let's talk about, we know the history, we know what was present downtown. We know that African Americans not only just, they lived downtown, but they were part of the tourism development of slave owners and then evolving into some business ownership themselves. Talk to us about the history and how that's changed and the landscape now.
Thank you, Kimberly. We fast forward, if you will, to about the 50s, thereabouts, where Eagle Market Streets, which is now known as Eagle Market Streets District, comes into view. The YMI, the Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church, and the foundry buildings that reside in that area. In the 50s, the Eagle Market Streets District was known as the Black Wall Street of Western North Carolina. That's how dense it was with residences and businesses in that area. Of course, urban renewal comes after that, and blight and slum comes after that, and so you have an area that loses its vibrancy and the ability to thrive and becomes somewhat gentrified, which is where Eagle Market Streets kind of enters the picture as the land trust, if you will, to salvage several buildings in the area, the Del Cardo, the Dr. Colette, the Ritz building. All of them have significant historical contribution to the area. The Dr. Colette building was once the building that housed the first African-American doctor and dentist that came to the area. The Del Cardo was a drugstore. It was a retail co-op that had a beauty shop and several other things. And in its last iteration, it was a nightclub that played some notable folk like Al Green. So, you know, again, that rich history is there, but, you know, because of the lack of economic resources and opportunities, fell into some disarray. So we're revitalizing it as we speak.
Revitalizing it, but let's piggyback on that as well. Sasha and Dr. please jump in. We're revitalizing, but there's still a lot of folks left out of the picture. And how do you believe that, you know, economic development, maybe slanted to one need, is really driving what the landscape looks like downtown? And what do you see that could lead to maybe in the future?
Well, there's actually, I talked about Asheville as a tourist destination, which, I mean, it started off, its great popularity was about the health in the mountains and the cool air, and it was a health resort. And in our time now, if you look at all of these hotels coming up, people have pinned the hopes of Asheville on money coming from people who want to visit this area. Every poll that comes out and says this is a wonderful place to visit, I agree, I love it. I've been here for 6 years and I moved here from New Jersey because I read about it in a magazine or somewhere and said that's the place for me. And I do believe this is a place of great opportunity. However, when a business comes in and when a hotel comes in and knocks a city block down that may have housed smaller structures, what happens when the economic development is leaning toward these large pieces of property, you can't do much else with that. It's been nice to see the Aloft Hotel has some businesses underneath at the street level, but you're really pushing out the ability of a smaller operator to do anything there. And that's what would hurt. Going forward, Asheville will not have that same pull as a place to pursue independent pursuits and for a small business owner to really be able to grow and have a wide area of places to choose from in terms of real estate and places to be if there's so much devoted to big box hotels. And that's
or even outside dollars in general as a model.
Yes, that's true. It's much easier to have this conversation about buying local among the people who live here. And when someone comes from out of town, it seems like they are, happy to see anthropology or whatever. Asheville's a beautiful place with lots of local and unique things, but it has that drive. This buy local movement has to communicate that. Come here to see Asheville, buy the things unique to Asheville, go to the businesses that have to be here because that's what supports and feeds the community.
Or entire infrastructure.
What I would add to what Sasha and Stephanie have said, and looking at the history, and one of the biggest challenges I think that African American business historically has always had, one of the biggest challenges is access to capital. I mean, we talk about the period of segregation. One of the most important developments on what became known as the block was the creation of the YMI in 1892. And it became really the hub that drew everything else there. I mean, there are photographs that you can see that before the YMI, there was not much there. The YMI, not only as an institution, a cultural and social institution, it was also meant to be a business incubator. So when you look at the way the building was designed from the very beginning, it was meant to be Black-owned businesses that would help support the programs of the YMI. As I looked at the history and looking at the records coming from Biltmore State, the one thing that you see repeatedly is the difficulty that Black-owned business owners had in keeping businesses open. And it had a lot to do with the economic challenges that African Americans faced here simply because of no other reason, because of discrimination. And one of the issues that they faced too is that while we had segregation, white business owners could always compete for the business of Blacks. And they did that. People like Carter G. Woodson, who is the major African-American historian who established what we know as African-American history, has explored this in depth. There's another historian who recently has explored it, and if you want to see what this looks like, I think I would highly recommend his book, and that book is by Robert Weems, and it's entitled Desegregating the Dollar. And once white business owners realize that there's a lot of business to be drawn from black people just in general, yes, they go after that. And because black businesses had difficulty getting access to capital, it's hard to compete with people who can lower their prices and sell, can sell things at a much lower price than you can. One record that I had from Biltmore Estate is a case in point. We've all heard the name Thomas Leatherwood. Just recently, because one of his newspapers, he started the Colored Enterprise, which was a black newspaper that he published here, and there was a copy of that newspaper in the time capsule that was pulled out of the Vance Monument just recently. Well, Thomas Leatherwood is also the first person to establish a black pharmacy in the YMI building. And at one point, the estate is trying to do business with him, and there's a letter that was exchanged between Leatherwood and one of the estate managers asking if he could give a certain number of items at a more competitive price than his white competitors. If not, they were going to do the business with the white competitor. Ultimately, he ends up having to close the pharmacy because of the challenges of competing with other businesses that can give items at a much lower price, and because he doesn't have access to capital. There's another problem that he faces, that African Americans, because they're not making that much money. It's interesting to look at Asheville now and to look at the service sector, because in the late 19th century, early 20th century, it's African Americans who dominate the service sector here. Today, that's not the case. When you look at Asheville today, you don't see that. It's kind of shifted. And one of the questions is, why is that the case? I think racial discrimination has had a lot to do with that. And I think that those are things that we have to deal with in order to, it has to be acknowledged, first of all, that these problems exist. And I think before we can move forward in developing better relations in this regard.
Well, and before you answer, I want to have you answer a different question, Stephanie. So, based on what the two of you said, and transitioning and looking forward, I really appreciate your comments, but part of the issue is, as we move forward and prices increase for real estate, and redevelopment is on the top of the mind of those who run economic development committees downtown, smaller businesses are pushed out, whether they be white, black, Hispanic, Latina, depending on where you're from, Asian, transgender run, what have you. It doesn't matter specifically about that, it's more about the local, right? As prices increase because tourism is driving things and we want it to look a certain way, the block doesn't really get that kind of advertisement. I've lived here 12 years and I remember all of the advertising done outside the area for tourism. The block was like this invisible area that nobody wanted anybody to go to. Are you seeing a shift, or do you see that's still a real problem, and it's one of the reasons why some of those businesses don't thrive?
I think that truly it continues to be a challenge for the area and for Eagle Market Streets as we look at trying to bring healthy businesses into the area for this revitalization that we want to occur. And I think Darin hit it square on the head. In order to be a healthy, vibrant business, you need access to capital to properly operate your business, and we continue to have that as a struggle for these businesses. But I'm hopeful, very hopeful, that as we develop the Eagle Marketplace project, which will, during the time of urban renewal, there were about 72 residences in the area and about 50 thriving businesses. Our project returns about 62 of those residences not conventional, of course, housing, but workforce and affordable rental housing. And we should have roughly about 25 of those businesses returning to the area. But the single most important thing that I heard you asking that question is about making us a destination hub, and how do we do that so that those businesses have an opportunity to compete and thrive.
And then after this, I'm going to turn it over to the audience to get some questions.
And Kimberly, I would add to what Stephanie said here that I think that we talked about capital. I think creative energy is also important. As a historian, part of what I think is important in studying the history is to give us an understanding of what the unique experiences of African Americans in this region is. We know what the experiences of white Southern Appalachians are because historians have studied, scholars have been studying this for a while. We know what the experience of Native Americans is in this region because scholars have studied that. Scholars have not studied the African American experience in Southern Appalachia, Western North Carolina, Southern Appalachia in the same manner. So there is something unique about the experiences of African Americans here. And I think that as you do the research to understand that, it can give creative energy to other people like artists who can explore that in a very different way. It's essentially saying, if you study the Harlem Renaissance, the Renaissance begins with the intellectual activity, the people who are understanding the history that gives creative energy to other artists, business leaders to be able to use that information to create opportunities for people to explore that experience in a way that would, I think, enhance the tourism economy here.
Well, and what I'm hearing you say, actually, is if we understand displacement and how it's been a big part of the downtown revitalization over 150 years, if one people group were displaced to make room for more economic development, then what about the small business owners now? Will they be displaced to make room for more economic development? So really what we're talking about is a conversation of displacement. And that is part of our history. And as we continue to displace people for more of this or more of that, and not really bring along our history and make room for who was here and who needs to stay here, we will continually displace one another. And I think that's like, boom, right? We got that. Isn't that good? That's good. Okay, questions for our panelists. I won't be answering any questions because I want to, can you just stand up, say your name, and I'll try and repeat if people can't hear you.
Yeah, my name's Dawn, and I might just be loud enough for everybody to hear. But I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, and a lot of what we're talking about is happening there as far as it getting so big and so many outside businesses coming in and really pushing out small businesses. And so there aren't businesses that actually service the community. Hairstylists, those kinds of things, smaller businesses. What are ways that we as citizens and small business owners can kind of use, besides voting and keeping our money in small businesses, what are other strategies we can implement so that we can stop that from happening?
Right, so what are the strategies we can implement to stop homogenization from happening?
I've got one great one. Walk your neighborhood. It is much easier to see the people around you, to see the small storefronts when you are walking. It's good for you. And it will give you a very intimate relationship with the place you live. You will see the cracks in the sidewalk. You will understand the infrastructure investment that's been happening in your community. You are going to have a personal relationship with those business owners who sweep the sidewalk in front of the local businesses. That's a great way, besides shopping, is to be a part of that community by being present. We talk about breathing and being in your body. Be in your neighborhood, not driving by. And it's hard because when you're trying to talk about business in a downtown area, it's expensive to live downtown. So yes, you may have to drive from somewhere else. But it's also hard to find parking. So go ahead and park somewhere else. And walk downtown, walk through, and get to know those people who are pushing the broom, selling the stuff, and trying to make a go of it.
I would echo that and say be intentional. Be intentional about shopping local and about supporting local business. I think is a wonderful way to kind of advocate, if you will.
Well, I'm going to use Franzi's statistic, Franzi, wherever you are, I'm hijacking you, but for every $100 that's spent locally, just from what you're saying, $45 get recirculated in that community. Anything that you spend locally that's actually not from a local business, only $13 stays in that community. And that's the byproduct of hiring accountants, and not just to have staffing employees, but that money gets reused with other businesses as opposed to outside the companies and corporations. Sorry, I didn't mean to hijack you. Did you have a comment? And the last thing I want to say, you said, what can you do? For those of you that don't know, economic development is great, but when it's driven by TDAs and CVBs, Tourist Development Associations and Convention and Visitors Bureaus, they only make their money by tourism, heads and beds. When you understand that economic development of downtowns are often driven by the need to increase heads and beds, because that's the only way they make money, you'll start to make different choices about where you serve on boards, how involved you get in with TDAs, CVBs, and chambers to make sure that they're being regulated and governed by the interest of the local community and not just outside dollars. So that's another way to do it. Yes.
I've been thinking since I've lived here, which is 26 years, that the Eagle Market Street area has to have been intentionally designed. Those roads must have been intentionally designed to isolate that neighborhood. And I really want to call on anybody involved with the city or soon to be involved with the city to seriously address the isolation of the driving paths of those roads. You don't go down there. It was designed to keep people from going down there. So that's one thing that I think needs to be brought into the history of why one of the reasons people Market Street is separate. The feng shui is off. That's just like the design is off. I also have recently become interested in, and this may be for you, sir, or anybody, but I've recently become really interested in, I'm part of a little small think tank group who's exploring community land trusts as a solution for a lot of these problems, from green space to gentrification, affordable housing, and I imagine for business in certain districts. And I wonder if any of you are aware of areas or models around those community land trusts in that way, or is that already being considered for this region, or maybe downtown also?
So the question is, how do community land trust?
If there's any community land trusts that they know be
Sure.
models elsewhere where it's been used in the business sense.
Great, so Dr. Waters and maybe Stephanie might be able to answer that question.
Stephanie probably knows better than I do. I don't know the answer to that question, but one thing that I would address that you just talked about is there was something gained with desegregation and there was a lot lost. I don't think that we've really been able to, that we've really discussed that. Academics have not yet. That community, in a few weeks we'll be hosting the second annual African Americans in Western North Carolina conference at the university. And one of the things that we're going to do this year in that conference is we'll be unveiling a photo collection that has not been seen, that no one has seen. It's ironic that we have this photo collection because it was actually my grandfather's, is his collection. And this was his hobby. He was born in, I think, 1917, he died in 1980. But from the 1940s forward, he was just randomly taking photographs all around Asheville as he moved through the town as he was working. Some of the photographs are phenomenal. But what you see in those photographs, especially of Eagle Market Street, is a very vibrant, active community. You see in spaces here now where you don't generally see African Americans, like Pritchard Park. African Americans are all over these spaces in the late 1950s and 60s. So you have to ask the question, what happened? Why isn't that the case now? And I think that these photographs are going to create a whole new conversation. And I think that desegregation is what happened. Desegregation, and then coupled with that, urban renewal, because you removed a whole constituency from that area. The YMI, I think, struggled more because its constituency was moved. You desegregated the schools, but you got rid of Stevens Leave, which was such an important institution to Black action. So I think that those have had a detrimental effect on especially Eagle Market Street. And it's interesting to think about this. If you've never read Thomas Wolfe is interesting because I think Thomas Wolfe has more to say about race than we have generally thought. And so there's kind of this renewed effort to re-examine Thomas Wolfe and what he's saying. 1920, he wrote his play, Welcome to Our City. I don't know if any of you have ever read that play, but I would encourage you to read the play because in 1921, he was essentially projecting what eventually happened to Eagle Market Street. That it was prime property that certain people in the community were going to eventually want. And we see that kind of happening over time. So you get the displacement of African Americans, and I think that that's something that has to be addressed.
Yeah, displacement has to be addressed, and so the land trust conversation is great. Sasha, you seem like you're chomping at the bit.
Well, no, I actually read an article about a land trust situation in Texas, and it might not be exactly the same properties coming up for sale, and rather than letting it go to the highest outside bidder, local people got together and said, we're going to buy this, and turned it around and said, we'll use it to incubate businesses and let them grow out and then feed more and then buy our next property. Is that similar to what a land trust does? Like
A land trust essentially just holds the title of a property.
Mm-hmm.
And
Restricts it.
And then restricts in what, not in a monolithic way, but property by property restricts what can be used on it. And therefore, and the building on the property, the structures on the property are owned by the owner. But the property is title separate. So that keeps that out of just the market forces. Because in Asheville, many of our pieces of property are more valuable than the buildings that are on it.
Well, right, and they're privately owned.
Super important.
Well, I would say that what's happened is that those people, like you'd say a group of people, a group of small business owners, still really would struggle to compete with outside big businesses when it comes to making that kind of power play that's going to feed back to the community. And the way to fight against that is to really be involved in local politics so that when decisions are made about, how local businesses funded, what kind of help small businesses get, that the conversation is directed more toward the local. And as far as displacement, if I could just add one thing, it was kind of a surprise to me to find that my own three greats grandfather had a business on Eagle Street. I didn't know it. I'm from New Jersey. I knew I had an ancestor in North Carolina. It was one of these over here. I think it's kind of off the map, like right over here. And it's next door to where there's a barber shop, and there always was a barber shop for many, many, many years. There's still one there. But if you look at that area now, there's a bunch of small businesses, and then there was going to be a parking structure. There's kind of an empty spot. Anytime that an empty spot gets put in place where there was a number of small business places, there is a shift, yes. Because as a small business owner, I think all of you here are probably small businesses, you know that it's much easier to rent a small space to get started. And if those small spaces get taken away, then you're going to lose that opportunity. So I would say, looking forward, think small. Think of ways that the small person is going to have a chance to get started. And really, if that means that small is too small, group together and work together.
I want to piggyback on that and then go to you and then go to the audience. Sherry and I were having a conversation this morning. Raise your hand, Sherry, everybody can see you. And we were just having this conversation about preservation. So it goes back to what you were saying, Michelle, that you guys are familiar with the building that just got knocked down on the corner of Biltmore, the bricks. That was a historic hospital for African Americans. And so it's gone. Boom, all the bricks you're looking at, boom, see it. So the history, all that, and I don't know if you've ever been in that building, but the offices were really small. So it could have been something that could have been converted to something collective for many businesses, but now something larger will go in its place. So just being educated about history, these boards will actually be in the other room so that you can look at where have we been? What has been the landscape of our region? How is that evolving? Are the buildings getting larger and bigger so that the smaller local businesses can't afford to be downtown anymore? Whether they're African American, whether they're hip replacements, doesn't matter exactly who the owner is at this moment. We're talking about displacement and how the landscape is changing, becoming bigger and bigger so that we can no longer afford to start and grow businesses as local citizens. Dr. Waters.
I was just going to say too, with Sasha and Stephanie said that progress is good. I mean, we want progress. That's part of our history, a theme of our history. But I think we have to acknowledge that most progress has always come at the expense of African Americans. It just has. I mean, we're still seeing that. I mean, when we're doing either road expansion, historically African American communities end up bearing the brunt of that. I mean, a case in point even now is the threat to the Burton Street community, where my mother grew up there. But that's been an ongoing fight for a long period of time. And I think that we have to be consciously aware of that. And we have to pay real attention to what political leaders are doing and not let them get away with making some of these decisions. We have to decide that this is important, that these injustices have to be corrected, they have to be addressed, and they have to be corrected.
Yeah, the progress at the expense of displacement, no bueno, right? Question, yes, Kitty.
So you said something kind of just briefly earlier about how our culture is advertised. And my understanding of what, the tourism, and when we talk about political leaders, I think beyond elected officials, TDA or their political leaders in the community. So, there's a third, like what I understand from the research they've done, there's a third of the people that are coming here that are looking for that deeply experiential, the cultural heritage tourism. And you said earlier that, traditionally African American culture and the culture of legal markets in particular hasn't been advertised. So my question is, are we waiting for them to figure out how to advertise it, or is there something that we can hand them and say, okay, yeah.
I'm actually the chair of our local African American Heritage Commission. It is one of our jobs to figure that out. I just recently, I read that study by the Tourism and Development Authority. I'm not sure if they're the ones. There are 3 different, partners. Tourism Development, the Chamber of Commerce, and another. I noticed that study did mention the numbers of African Americans, but it was just very brief. I wanted to know the age breakdown, how many of them were coming for cultural experiences. Maybe they had that number, but it wasn't communicated. I was up late last night working on a map. I've got, I didn't mention, but one of my old side projects was creating a Black-owned business directory online. I have a website called colorofasheville.net. There are about 100 Black-owned businesses on there. And these are not necessarily businesses that are going to be in the phone book. Sometimes it's somebody who does hair in their living room. But I try to make it wide open and communicate over and over to people that I found this really awesome quote by Martin Luther King when he was talking about the power of boycotts. But I said that flip side is just as powerful, that when you direct your dollars toward what you want to support, you are making them powerful. You're using your power and giving them power. You can give it and you can take it away. So I always say, shop first on that directory. For every truism about buying local, if you say to the Black community, we're losing power here, we need to fix it, put that money back in your neighbor's pocket. If everyone's committed to doing that, that money will keep circulating. But yes, as far as tourism, I went on the website of the chamber, I think it was Explore Asheville. There was a little blurb underneath that said African American history. I said, oh my gosh, wow, I didn't even know they had that. And I clicked on it, and the very first thing was the rhythms of Africa. And it talked about the drum circle at Pritchard Park. And I thought, I have never seen a black person down there at Pritchard Park. It's certainly not drumming. Yeah, they might be playing an African drum. And then it talked about YMI and what it used to be. And it talked about Eagle Market Street and what it used to be. And I wanted to cry. And I thought, all right, well, I have to talk to my commission members about that. But the only thing I can say is it's on us to fix that and say, here, Development Authority, this is what we've put together. And that's a project we're working on right now.
As the academic, I will say this, and this is a conversation I've been having with a number of my colleagues. I had it with Harry Harrison before Harry left here, before Harry passed away, before he left here, because he was an artist. You can't market what you don't know. So you've got to first know what it is. The African American community here, the experiences are different, they're unique. This is Southern Appalachia. What is that experience? We don't know. There is a major project that is kind of moving forward now called the Afro-Latcha Project, where you've got a group of writers and artists who are trying to explore what is the unique experience of African Americans in Southern Appalachia. Because if you build programming around that unique experience, it's going to be different from what, let's say, the African American community in places like Charlotte or Atlanta are going to offer. And especially since tourism is such a big part of what we do here, then when people come here, you want them to experience that unique experience, but you can't do that if you don't know what it is. So we have the drum circle that African Americans don't participate in, which is dealing with the Africa drum circle. And I think it's important for African Americans to understand their African roots, but you also need to understand your roots as African Americans in this particular space. Understand that we just don't. We have the Goombay Festival here, which is an Afro-Caribbean festival. But I argue that in the heart of that, you need to have the African-American experience in Southern Appalachia. That's what we need to understand, we need to know, and then you can market and you can sell that. History sells. I mean, Biltmore State does it every day. They're selling history. They're looking for ways to incorporate the African-American story into what they do at Biltmore State, which I think is important. But African-Americans have to try to understand what their experiences here are as well and how they can use that as an economic tool to kind of further develop the community. So I'm encouraging people to just begin to explore, to understand what is the unique experience of African-Americans in Western North Carolina and Southern Appalachia.
Yes, I see what you're saying now.
I had a couple of questions. I can hear her, so I'll restate what you're saying.
So about the land trust, there's a small business subcommittee of the Downtown Commission that's trying to reach out to sympathetic property owners who may be interested in putting deed restrictions or their properties into land trusts. And so that, to me, speaks to creating this kind of like web of like-minded individuals from the visitor consumer, the local consumer, the retailer and business owner, the property owner, and then city government. And so how do we create those relationships from, the top down and bottom up, either way, to create that web of network to put in to support small business?
So are you is this part of the question, or you're leading
Not
into
just a statement for
Got it.
her, as far as is there anything happening locally with land trusts, and we're trying to develop that,
Yes.
idea of long-term smart growth and development versus like greed and
Sure.
property taxes. And then my other question, kind of like in creating that network, how are we protecting the current like last strongholds of African American owned businesses on the block? There's just like Mr. Smooth, like how are we creating a network to support him so his business continues to thrive? And then from there, like recruiting and nurturing other African American businesses to be strong in that area, neighborhood, and in downtown Asheville and beyond, and will some of those businesses that have kind of been displaced, like through the redevelopment of that area with the Carter building, Ebony Grill, and some of those businesses that have gone, is there like some of those businesses are definitely going to go to African Americans, and how do we recruit even outside small businesses from like New Jersey that are maybe going to be African American.
So I'm going to restate the question. Thank you for everyone to hear. So the question on the floor is, how do we, A, encourage, us as a community to support African American businesses that exist downtown? And the sub question of that is, and how do we help encourage other businesses to come in that are minority owned and stay downtown? Before Stephanie, I'd like you to answer first. Before I go there, I do want to say thank you for that question. And I think it's important for us to understand that the reality behind the scenes on rental, leasing downtown property, and I see my friend Sharon Oxendine shaking her head, is you have no idea how many times behind the scenes that African Americans have wanted to lease property downtown, have gone to building property owners, and because they're African American, they were refused. And then the next day, it was leased to someone who was not African American. And that is real, that is happening every day, and so that's part of the problem. And there are people in this room that can actually verify, name, date, serial number, how many times it's happened over the last 15 years downtown. So, go ahead.
So I want to start to answer the question by going back to something that Darin said about whenever there's progress, there's an upside and a downside, if you will. And certainly in order for us to have this vibrant, thriving, economic engine that we want to be African American business, I think we first have to think about local small business. Regardless to the ethnicity of the business, we have to think local and we have to think small business. Small business is the engine driving our economy right now and probably into the next decade at least. To answer your other question though, Eagle Market Streets has been very intentional about seeking out African American participation, particularly in the Eagle Marketplace project. The Del Cardo that you mentioned will be 75% minority participation in that effort. But I think in order, again, for us to have healthy, sustainable communities, we have to count all of us. We really do. I also tag what Darin said about knowing your space, and once you know your space, now how do you fit into that, or how do you fit into a new space? So I would just say that for our organization, we're being very intentional about looking for those businesses and trying to help those businesses. For many of the businesses that were in the area prior to the Eagle Marketplace project coming online, they were not able to compete at that time, but we've kept a record and been intentional about staying in touch with them so that they can come back if they're strong enough to participate.
Okay, and yeah, I see, and you've had your hand up for a long time, Anthony, so next.
Yeah, very informative. I really appreciate learning about something I remember about. Two questions. One is I'm wondering if anybody on the panel is familiar with Policy Link and their toolkit to prevent gentrification, or at least minimize gentrification as redevelopment happens, particularly in communities of color. So that's just a question there. And then the second one is around subsidies, economic development subsidies. I'm wondering what Asheville or Buncombe County's policy. I know I'm from Southwest Virginia, and a couple of years ago, we had this thing where the same day in the Bristol Herald Courier, they on the front page announced a $54 million subsidy to bring in Cabela's, and on the back paper they were celebrating a grant to the local entrepreneur of the year, which was $5,000, which is a 10,000-fold difference. So even though we're all about local business, there's still this unbelievably disproportionate public money, taxpayer money. So I'm wondering about subsidies and what the sort of lay of the land is, and then on policy.
These are all Stephanie, I think.
We have a unique situation in Asheville, that Asheville is one of the few cities that has community development block grant dollars that are accessible for economic development as well as for infrastructure. most larger areas, it's all about infrastructure. And those dollars are applicable to the communities that we serve and are short in number at the moment, or small in number, but we certainly have the opportunity to compete for them. And Eagle Market Streets is currently an award, a grantee award of CDBG funds that will help us in our efforts to bring commercial minority business into the Eagle Market Streets district. Policy Link I am not familiar with. Thank you for giving me the information. I will be mindful to look that up.
But I think also another point is, haven't those dollars decreased over the last 6 years? I just, since you're bringing it up, Anthony, I thought it would talk about the elephant.
Exactly. Well, and certainly that's when I said in small number, that's exactly what I meant. From the federal level, those dollars have diminished, and while the competition for them has been exponential. So yeah, but again, the opportunity exists. And as always, when we have more demand than we have resources, that often leaves really good projects and applications out. But again, that opportunity exists.
Great, thank you. We have 2 more questions, and then we're closing out. So Tyler, and then we'll close off and over there.
Access to capital. I'm kind of similar to what he was just talking about, but we all know about the chamber, we all know about the drive for the tourism business. What's the alternative? What are the boards for us to go sit on? What are the groups and organizations for us to be a part of that are incubating small businesses, that are getting capital to, it's not mutually exclusive, but it's pretty close. I mean, either your focus is on tourism and bringing in tourist industry, or it's focused on building industries from small businesses. And one is very obvious and very readily available. I personally don't know where to sit on board for the other. So does anybody have any, this could really be open to the room as far as that goes. But where can we go sit? Where can we go? Where should we put the feet, the feet on the street, so to speak? Where should they go?
I'm not sure what the exact answer to that, the specific answer to that would be. What I did discover not too long ago is that there are a lot of resources that are available that people just don't know that are there. And I think that Stephanie has probably found that to be the case as well. And it's encouraging people to know that those resources are there. There is a project that is going on here in Asheville. The leaders of this project have not yet publicly announced it. They will later in October. And it's a former resident from Asheville who is helping to lead this. Tracy Dorsey is her name. And the name of the project is called the Co-Think Project. And when you hear something about it, I would encourage you to get more information about it. I think they're going to announce the creation of this project. They've been meeting. It's a group of minorities that have been meeting. Steph, it's okay to mention this, right?
We're short on time, so I'm going to say that, go to Sasha, and
so I think knowing about that is
He's talking about the Co-Think, and October the 24th at the block off of Biltmore will be an opportunity for you to come. Co-Think is a giving circle led by minorities, particularly African Americans, around how to infuse your dollars into the community and into small business. So come see us on the 24th of October at block off of Biltmore.
Sasha.
And I'm sorry, Jane just walked out of the room, but the self-help credit unions are always more about the community. Mountain BizWorks talks about local lending. AB Tech has lots of resources for small businesses. I tell my folks all the time, there are lots of resources here in town devoted toward helping local business. So check with those three to begin with.
And I'm going to answer your question differently, which is I think a little different way. I would, see if there's subcommittees for the commissioner's office. You know, place where policy and decisions for downtown buildings and regulations are made. I'd also look at the Downtown Association. If you don't have a business downtown, but if we require them to have subcommittees that are representative of our regional kind of local interest, maybe because we don't meet their criteria, we don't own a business downtown, but we can require a subcommittee that advises them. I think that's really important. And my last recommendation, besides county commissioners and the Downtown Association, is a TDA or the CDB. I mean, at this point, I think as a collective group of business owners, if we require them to have a subcommittee that is about the better interest of smaller businesses and local businesses, they understand that now we have an eye and an interest, and we're watching that they're not solely putting all their focus on drivers that change the local landscape of business owners. So those are some hands-on activities. I think collectively today we could figure out how to go talk to them and require some change within the next 3 to 5 months.
And could I also add too, I would encourage you, those of you, to also get on some of the local boards or the historical site boards so that you can have influence on how stories are told. A case in point here is the band's birthplace. I mean, I have had conversations with the executive director there about how they're trying to rewrite the narrative of how the story is told, but they're getting pushback from their local board on certain things that need to be incorporated into the story. They have not rewritten that narrative in 60 years, and they're trying to do it now, but he's getting major pushback. And so he ended up asking me, would you be on, well, I can't be on every board, but it would be good if others who are concerned about how certain narratives and stories are told would get on those boards so that you can have influence on how we tell the larger story about the history of not only just Black Asheville, but of Asheville in general.
I love it. Okay, last question on the floor.
I was actually also going to comment on the access to capital issue, because I mean, as you pointed out so eloquently, barring access to capital has been continuing racism. I mean, because it is town. This is something that we don't talk about a lot. So, as sort of a social capital market grows, is there anything coming out of that that gives you hope that there will be some alternatives to, systemic racist banks or something somewhere that
Is there anything coming out of
the social capital markets or just
impact investment? Okay.
Is there anything there that you're interested in?
Jay?
I just want to make a point that the next panel is going to be on access to capital, and we talked about that as well.
So give us a break over here. Thanks.
I was just going to say that as well, that there are several folk in the room who are qualified to speak to that, so yeah.
Yeah, and I will say, to create a disclaimer here, or just be open, I am on the board of Self-Help Credit Union, and part of my goal in being there is it's an organization that's focused on funding and driving minority businesses and homeownership. And so there is a high emphasis for that. But it takes more than just a couple of organizations. It really takes, this is why we started the Venture Local event with the history. It's very African American focused, but you really need to understand the history of a region and how the core value of what we're saying here is displacement, and the lack of honoring the history of displacement leads to more displacement. And at this conference where we're talking about local business and how vital it is for the very essence of how we grow our communities and our neighbors and making sure each of us has an equitable, fair-paying job, displacement can no longer move forward. So we hope you enjoy the rest of this conference. We hope we were helpful in providing information. And I'd like to honor my panelists by saying thank you to Sasha Mitchell, thank you to Dr. Waters, and thank you to Stephanie Swepson-Twitty. Thank you very much.